Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues. Madam Speaker, it's always an honour to be able to join and debate the important issues that are facing Canadians. And before I jump into the subject matter of Bill C-33, I would just note that yesterday represented the second anniversary since the 2021 election. And I would just note on that regard, my deep appreciation to the people of Battle River Crowfoot for the opportunity to continue serving them in this place, to be their voice in Canada's Parliament, and a big thanks to my wife Danielle and my kids and my whole family for their support, and my staff and volunteers and campaign team and everybody it takes to make elections happen. And I would just further note, Madam Speaker, that it was interesting that that Liberal Prime Minister actually, in the course of that last election, promised that if he were elected with a minority, he would call an election after 2 years. Well, another broken promise by a Liberal that cares more about power than he does anything else. And further, he also promised, I would note, Madam Speaker, and then I look forward to jumping into the substance of C-33, but he also promised that he would not join a coalition with the NDP, despite Conservatives suggesting that that was an inevitable result. They laughed at us then. We turned out to be the ones that told the truth, and the Liberals exposed for once again misleading and holding on to power and at any cost, Madam Speaker. You know, as we get into the debate on what C-33 is, I think that once again we have before us a bill, and I've said this often when it comes to Liberal bills, that if you read the preamble, there's very little that one would disagree with. The Liberals are great at making announcements, they're great at proposing things, they're great at saying that they are doing things, but once again, when you dig into the substance of what we have before us, it certainly falls short. We have a bill here that it touches on a whole host of different things when it comes to our rail sector and our ports and dealing with some of our deep sea ports. There's 7 different acts that are affected. And Madam Speaker, Canada as a country, transport, both the rail and sea transport sectors are absolutely fundamental to the success of our nation. We have to be able to get our goods and our resources, whether that be the raw resources that come from the ground or the value-added resources in every segment of the economy that is produced everywhere across our nation. Madam Speaker, we need to have a sector, a transport sector that we can trust, that is reliable, that is safe, that is secure, and that not only that Canadians can trust, but when it comes to investment from around the world, when it comes to our customers from around the world, they have to be able to look at our system and know and trust that it is doing the right thing. Now, Madam Speaker, there have been concerns that have been highlighted, and I know that it's getting to be a few transport ministers ago now. They seem to fall at an astonishing rate, but in 2017, the then Minister of Transport, the now retired member Marc Garneau, launched the statutory review of the Railway Safety Act. And over the course of the last number of years, we have seen different steps in that process. And it was on October of last year that the previous Transport Minister received the final report from the National Supply Chain Task Force, and now we have this bill before us. However, when it comes to whether or not this bill accomplishes the concerns that have been highlighted, Madam Speaker, we are hearing increasingly that it's pure and simple does not. And I would note, Madam Speaker, that one of the first issues that I and many of my colleagues dealt with after we were elected was elected in 2019 was the rail strikes just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. There were blockades, there were protests that had virtually ground our economy to a halt. In fact, Madam Speaker, it would have been very interesting to see how the Liberals' mismanagement of that situation, the impact that it would have had on the economy, had we have had the opportunity to see the direct impacts of that. But of course, Madam Speaker, we know that in the aftermath of that, we went immediately into the COVID pandemic, and focus for the last number of years obviously changed dramatically. But the bill we have before us, we are changing aspects of the rail railway safety and safety, including security, Madam Speaker. There are prohibitions and some changes to the way that things are classified. We need to ensure that railway companies are able to address security. And when it comes to some of the ensuring that the staff on for rail companies, that there are those appropriate clearances provided and that there are continual reviews. I would just note, if I could, Madam Speaker, when it comes to the review portion, it's great to ask for statutory reviews, but I'm sure I am not alone, like many in this place, who would note that statutory reviews rarely happen when they are scheduled to. We have, I would, in fact, I will be asking the Library of Parliament to go through and look at all of the statutory reviews that are currently missing. So it's great to talk about a statutory review, but it is nothing more than boilerplate language that it doesn't do much good if you don't actually plan to review it. So, Madam Speaker, I believe that some of these things, again, laudable in their intent, but when it comes to the substance of whether or not they accomplish it, many Canadians don't realize that railway companies actually have their own police forces because of some of the history associated with the importance of that as a sector of our economy and the growth of our country. Railway companies actually have their own police forces, and how some of the dynamics of how that and in some cases legislation that is almost as old as the country itself needs to be reflective on present-day reality. These are important questions that have to be asked when it comes to committee. Now, when it comes to the port side of things, Madam Speaker, and I don't have a long time, this is the sort of bill that truly takes a huge amount of time to get into some of the substance. But one of the, I'll go very, very high level here. One of the challenges that has certainly been brought to my attention is that there's two things that take place. One is that Ottawa gets a whole lot more authority, which interestingly enough the Bloc supports, which is an irony, I would suggest. But at the same time, they are downloading a whole bunch of the work to port authorities that don't necessarily have the resources to accomplish the objectives that will be brought forward if this bill is passed unamended. So, Madam Speaker, what I fear will be the case is that we will have more red tape, more bureaucracy, slowing down the decision-making process when it comes to our ports. And we know how essential that is, as it was only months ago that we had a strike at the Port of Vancouver, where it ground, certainly in Western Canada, it ground our economy virtually to a halt. I believe it was $500 million a day in economic impact, and months to clear the backlog. It will take to clear the backlog of that. And certainly when it comes to whether it's dry commodities like agriculture, whether it's oil, the carbon-based products that are essential for so many economies around the world that Canada has such a strong record of being able to provide. Madam Speaker, we have to make sure we do this right, and I think that it's not the answer to increase bureaucracy and download responsibility without understanding the impacts that will bring about on the people that are actually responsible for making sure that our economy is moving, and I say moving very, very specifically. So, Madam Speaker, I would bring up an example that emphasizes my point. Today in question period, the Minister of Health brought up natural health products. And I know all of us in this place have heard a lot about natural health products over the course of the summer. Now, Madam Speaker, what is the unfortunate trend is that this government is desperate to make changes on things that doesn't actually help, especially when you see the irony that this government is making a whole bunch of regulatory and bureaucratic changes to natural health products that nobody asked for, and certainly very few people that I've spoken to, whether in the sector or outside of it, support, yet they are pushing this down the throats of small business owners, of Canadians, in one of Canada's most trusted sectors. Yet you have that same health minister that supports the selling of hard drugs on our streets. So, Madam Speaker, here, and the reason why I bring this up is because it highlights the irony that you have a government that seems to be quick to propose things, look for ways that they can increase the size of government, the inefficiencies associated with that, and the red tape that impact the ability for the economy to function. But when it comes to actually delivering, they fail, and their priorities always seem to be in the wrong place, Madam Speaker. The questions I've asked certainly need to be addressed at committee. I hope that serious amendments can be made so that we don't allow that same trend to slow down a sector that is already being slowed down by a Liberal government that is simply out of touch.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech and welcome him back to the House as we are all back to do work for the people. One thing he didn't mention in his speech was what the Harper regime did in devastating railway safety. And you'll recall, Madam Speaker, that what the Harper regime did was it simply eliminated the kind of inspection regime that is so important to guarantee railway safety, replacing it with self-serve safety. Safety management systems that are run by corporate CEOs themselves. And the results, of course, Madam Speaker, we're all aware of some of the most disastrous accidents, the most tragic loss of life over the last few years have come as a result, in part, of the shift, the move away from inspections and the shift to self-managed safety management systems. So we see in this bill no real reflection of what is needed to ensure that we rebuild those safety systems and federal inspections. I wanted to ask my colleague if he agrees with me that the Harper regime made a mistake in self-managed safety, and if he agrees with me and the Transport Committee that we need to re-enhance railway safety. This is something the bill does not do.
Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I opened my speech acknowledging that it's been 2 years since the last election, and it wasn't long after that that the NDP also broke their word to the people of this country, along with the Liberals, where they suggested during the election that they would never form a coalition. But they would never form a government with the Liberals. Well, Madam Speaker, now you have the NDP that seem to be regretting the fact that they have their own government in actual fact and operational fact in this place when it comes to the support of being able to accomplish anything. They're now frustrated that their partners in crime, so to speak, Madam Speaker, are not doing what they want. Well, Madam Speaker, my suggestion is simply this, that if that member is so concerned about one of the bills that the government that they support isn't accomplishing what they want to bring forward, well, then maybe they should have thought twice about entering an agreement that they weren't honest about in the first place when they aren't actually being able to get anything out of it. Madam Speaker, that's certainly a question that I hear often as to what did the NDP get out of it? Certainly.
And comments, the Honourable Member for Kings Heads.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to start by recognizing the member opposite has a tremendous beard, and I mean that with all sincerity. He's been growing it over the summer, I see, and it's almost Tom Mulcair-esque, but I know he won't appreciate that comment as much. But I do want to address, because the government has put forward a number of pieces of legislation this week that are non-cost in nature. They are legislative reforms, one of which was, of course, C-33, but it's also C-49, which is about enabling tremendous economic opportunities in the energy sector in Atlantic Canada. I'm wondering if my honourable colleague opposite has had the opportunity to talk to either the member from South Shore St. Margaret's, West Nova, Cumberland Colchester, or Coastal Bay Notre Dame about whether or not they are in support of this, because this is what the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador is asking for, as is the Premier of Nova Scotia. Wondering if he's had a conversation with them.
Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Well, I'll let the comment about my facial hair, I guess, stand in the record now forever, but thank you, Madam Speaker. Look, I'd like to correct the record, because that member asked a question in question period that I found was really interesting about how there is support for the bill that he referred to. However, he's quick to point to when premiers and stakeholders will support a bill while failing to acknowledge when they oppose bills. Now, what's interesting is that the bill he refers to, C-49, specifically references provisions that that were implemented through Bill C-69 from a previous parliament. Now, the very premiers that were that have said they want energy development. Of course, we all do. We want, whether it's new tech, whether it's associated with traditional energy. We all want that, Madam Speaker. But those same premiers asked that government to repeal C-69. So now they're basically saying that they're talking out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to this government being.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The honourable member for Repentigny.
Okay, merci.
Madam Speaker, I know I don't have much time, but what I don't understand is that we in Quebec, we experienced this tragedy. It was analysed, and we know that what was missing was regulations, inspection. We also know that this program I talked about in my speech was such that the remuneration of the head of the business had to do was if he'd been efficient, but what he was judged on didn't have to do with security and all the other important things. So this speech, where he's talking about fewer regulations, especially given the tragedy, I think we should act in a non-partisan matter on this file.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And, I do find it interesting that, again, a member of a sovereigntist party would suggest that bureaucrats in the nation's capital are better at managing a sector of the economy that you would think would be better understood to that increased bureaucracy isn't necessarily the solution. Madam Speaker, we need to make sure that we have strong, effective regulations, not simply more red tape that would not accomplish the objective.
And the time is up. Resuming debate.